The mounted messenger drove his boot into the chapel step and hammered a heavy, stamped decree to the wooden door. Fear moved through the cluster of villagers like a hand passing along a bench. Marta felt it first as a tightness behind her ribs, and then as cold in her fingers. Thomas pushed forward, voice tight. "What county is this for?" he asked. The messenger looked past him and spat. "Orders from the county seat. New boundary." Effective now, that line, new boundary, effective now, named the problem plainly. Land and loyalties had been changed without an evening meeting, without the parish elders signing a single line. Marta kept her shawl closed. The word fear sat in her throat, but she used her hands to steady herself, folding them in her lap as she always did when thinking. She had been awake for the chores at dawn, milk cooled in the crook of her elbow, when neighbors began to shout. Within 5 minutes she had set down the milk, pulled on her boots, and walked to the chapel green. The opening scene contained immediate danger. The village could wake and find its labor owed to strangers, its taxes rerouted, its customary help now an obligation to a new name. Thomas found the printed seal still warm from the press. He traced the crest with a thumb that bore a callus from his plough. "Thomas, Marta, lo, we need the map." Her voice had the small, steady weight she used to call the children in for the noon meal. The crowd swelled. A constable in plain wool kept watch while neighbors argued over the exact phrase on the decree. The messenger did not hand copies. He set his horse, tied the reins, and did not speak about the night that had placed the stone. People spoke in bursts, short sentences. Who signed? Why not the parish? Do they take the sheep? Marta answered none of them. She pointed instead to the edge of the green where the boundary hedgerow met the lane. There was a nervous argument in the crowd. Thomas moved to the front and called the constable by name. Whether the fields still belonged to the families who had worked them. The constable's eyes slid away. The clerk would arrive, the messenger said, to record names. The villagers walked together, a dozen at first, and then 2 dozen, toward the field markers. Thomas ran a hand over his cap and kept looking down the furrows. He and Enya followed the hedgerow to the known stone, the worn marker where their fathers had rested hands and argued over grain shares. Where that stone lay, a new one now stood at an angle, fresh tool marks in the face, and a crest carved into damp earth that had not been dry at midnight. The discovery changed suspicion into anger. They moved the stone. "Enya!" They came in the night. Marta watched Thomas bend, fingers finding the old moss, hidden line. He pulled with 2 hands and the turned stone yielded a small clump of root. He shoved his shoulder against the earth and shook like he was dislodging a stubborn gate. Around them voices rose and fell into urgent demands. "Thomas, stop." Marta, touching his arm. Her touch steadied him. He looked at her and then at the new crest, and his jaw moved as if testing a decision. They returned to the village to gather maps and memories. In Marta's kitchen, a dozen people crowded the table. She set the old parish map flat and smoothed the curling edges with the heel of her hand. A small iron key lay beside it. She had carried it since the year her husband died. Marta lifted that key and placed it on a faded ink line that named the parish boundary from a century earlier. "This says we answer to the other side," she told them. Her fingers trembled, not from age but from the pull of a choice. Thomas spoke. "Thomas," he said, then more to the clerk who had arrived than to any neighbor, "if we do not sign, what happens?" The county clerk folded his hands in his lap, calm like paper folded on a desk. "Refusal brings fines, seizure, or petition. Swear and you keep your plots while I register you. Refuse and I report you to the magistrate." The clerk's offer sounded like a calculation. An oath in exchange for temporary security. Thomas counted the cost aloud. "I cannot swear to a name that walked in at night and turned our stones," he said. Voices pushed forward. "An oath takes the land, a man named Jarek, but no oath takes the blood from our palms." Marta listened to the argument. She watched people shift. Suspicion hardened into anger, and anger bent toward a choice. Marta set the map between them and said, "We can show them the charter. We can force a hearing." Her hands were small on the paper, but her mannerisms, folding, careful taps on the table, carried the authority of someone used to taking in trouble and naming it. At noon, Thomas walked out to the road and confronted the clerk again, the constable standing near with a spear looped at his belt. Their exchange tightened. "Thomas," the clerk said with a flat politeness, "sign and you remain. Refuse and the law takes its course. Thomas, said the constable simply. Thomas lifted his cap and put it in his hands. If you take our land, he said, who will feed your granary? The clerk did not answer with a story. He offered only the thin arithmetic of authority. That afternoon, Enya came to Marta with a small report. She had seen unfamiliar men in the lane one night, torches and a wagon with a wooden crate. They had been careful, she said, replacing a marker and smoothing the soil. Her voice tightened when she said they had laughed at one another, light and quick. The new information changed the scene from distant coercion to a deliberate action by named men. Marta felt a shift from anger to a focused hope. If there were witnesses, if dates and steps could be traced, the village could argue the change was invalid. Marta opened her wooden chest and took out a brittle parish list, a ledger kept by a long, dead clerk. The ink had blood in places, but the names matched those who still tilled the land. She found a marginal note, a clerk's scrawl with a date and a signature that placed the parish under a different authority centuries before the overnight change. She set the iron key over the script. This is our paper, she said. This makes the night thieves clerks on paper only, if we press it. Thomas ran his hand along the ledger, then folded it and pressed it against his chest. We must show them at dusk when the men return to the field. We must show them the stone turned back. His voice was a decision made into action. Word spread. Women swept thresholds and pinned shawls tighter. Children were sent to the smith to ask whether anyone had hired a man to move stones. The village constable sent a runner to the nearest town to fetch a witness who had seen the men. There was an external change, an arrival that mattered. Marta arranged pots over the embers while neighbors milled papers and compared dates. Each small task contained a reaction. Thomas paced, running a hand through his hair. Enya bit the side of her cheek until it hurt. Marta tied the ledger with string and tucked the key under her shawl. Dusk found them at the field boundary. The sky had the hard slate of a late autumn evening. Thomas led the small march with the old map in his pocket and the iron key hanging at Marta's neck. The constable watched from behind the group, not moving forward. The clerk's party met them at the turned stone with a handful of armed clerks and 2 constables. Voices rose at once. Thomas stepped forward and spoke his name. Thomas, he said, addressing the clerk directly, we ask you to remove your stone. We show you the old map and the charter. The clerk folded his arms. You will not touch county property, he said. You will not take down a legal marker. The confrontation quickened. Thomas squared his shoulders and moved to the stone. People began a rapid exchange of short lines. Thomas, watch the guard. Marta called. Marta, take the map. Enya shouted. Clerk, show me your writ, Jerick demanded. The clerk replied, my writ is on record. The back and forth contained 3 bursts of rapid dialogue where both sides pushed and named stakes. Thomas shoved his hand under the damp turf and pulled. He pried with a borrowed bar while others shouldered dirt away. The clerk ordered the constable to stop them. The constable hesitated, looking from face to face. Marta moved outward and placed the parish charter on the stone as it wrenched free, pressing its brittle pages to the fresh earth. Marta. She heard someone call as if the name would gather courage. Marta spoke in short sentences. We own the line. The charter bears this ink. She pushed the page into the crevice where the old stone had sat. The clerk stepped forward and struck the map with the flat of his hand. You cannot overwrite law with old paper, he said. The constable's hand brushed the hilt at his belt. Thomas met the clerk's gaze and did not look away. Then the unexpected moment arrived. A rider from the county seat appeared on the lane, his coat heavy with drizzle, holding a stamped packet that he said bore a higher seal. The rider's arrival changed the scale of the conflict. For a heartbeat, someone thought the higher seal would confirm the clerk's writ and end the struggle. Marta felt a shift from hope back to fear. The rider dismounted slowly and handed a folded parchment to the clerk. The clerk opened it, read, and his face moved through a set of small changes. Surprise, calculation, then a guarded acceptance. He stood. I will petition the magistrate up country. For tonight, leave the marker as found. Register your names. The clerk's words were neither surrender nor victory. They were a conditional truce. Voices sagged into a tired murmur. Thomas exhaled and wiped soil from his palms. Enya leaned on the old bar and laughed once, a short, sharp sound. Marta carried the ledger back to the chapel green and placed it under the lamp, where the ink shone on the page. She put the iron key into the small wooden box that held parish relics and locked it with the key itself, a small, deliberate gesture that sealed a domestic order against the day's upheaval. That night the village returned to a restless routine. Fires were banked, people walked lanes and counted fences. Thomas did a slow circuit of the boundary, hands running along fence posts, testing the wires, listening for footsteps. He paused at the field and pressed his ear to the turned stone, now half buried but left in place. He heard only the rain in the stubble. He watched for the constable's shadow and then turned toward Marta's house, because he needed someone who kept the ledger. Inside, Marta trimmed the lamp and hummed the same 2 notes she hummed while peeling potatoes. The song steadied her fingers. They did not speak much. When they did, their words were short, almost businesslike. "Thomas," Marta finally, handing him a bowl. "Thomas, will you rest?" "Thomas," he replied with a small smile, taking the bowl and setting it on the table. They spoke names in small sentences to keep the world anchored. Outside, someone cursed softly. Inside, the sound of a child coughing was answered by a woman's hush. The village had preserved its rhythms even under threat. A small twist came in the last hour before sleep. A letter was slid under Marta's door, damp at the edges, unsigned. It contained a single line that changed how they would press their case. The sentence named the surveyor who had carved the new crest and gave a time when he had been seen in the lane, hours before the clerk's arrival. The letter did not accuse a magistrate. It accused a local landholder who had been thought loyal to the original county. Marta held the paper with careful fingers and passed it to Thomas. "Thomas," she said, "they acted for a man in the next township, not the county seat. That means motive, and motive matters in a hearing." The new information was a pivot. It altered the suspect from an abstract bureaucracy to a named local interest. They planned quietly into the night. Marta wrote a short list of witnesses and times. Thomas walked the boundary again to make sure the footprints were still visible by morning. Enya offered to speak before the magistrate and went to fetch a man from the smith who had seen the men at night. Each small choice shifted emotion. Anger narrowed to purpose. Fear steadied into guarded determination. Hope opened like a door that might yet be slammed. The chapter closed on a concrete beat. Marta placed the ledger into a cloth and set it beneath the lamp so the ink would be visible at first light. She turned the key in her apron pocket and heard its small metallic sound. Outside, a light at the lane's end grew and then diminished as a horse passed. Thomas paused at Marta's threshold and said, "Thomas, tomorrow we go to the magistrate with witnesses." "Thomas, we hold the line." Marta nodded and closed the door on the day's noise. The last sound was a soft knock that came from beyond the lane and stopped at the step. That knock, hard, deliberate, and unanswered, sat at the chapter's end, a precise echo of the day's events and a clear signal that the next move would arrive by daylight. Fear, emotion shifts, suspicion, anger, hope, anxiety. Thomas lunged from the hedgerow and grabbed the shoulder of the nearest man, pulling him away from the lever as clods of earth flew. Suspicion tightened Thomas's hands. He smelled wet soil and iron and heard the dull wooden thud of the tool hitting packed ground. "Stop," he said, voice small and hard in the pre-dawn hollow. Men cursed, metal scraped, and a boundary stone rocked against its new cradle. Thomas did not wait to think. He twisted, trying to hold the man back by the coarse wool of his coat, and felt the man's elbow jab into his ribs. The man turned, jaw set, and Thomas saw a plain brass badge on his coat that meant enforcement, not farmers. The affair from the chapel had not yet cooled in the village. A mounted courier had driven a sealed decree into the chapel door 2 days before, and those words had already rearranged promises and quiet contracts. Thomas's suspicion grew into a pull at his chest that demanded to know who moved the stone and why. He hauled harder. "Who sent you?" Thomas demanded, mentioning the village name as if the sound would shame any official. The man spat and jerked free surveyor's orders, the man said, not meeting Thomas's eyes. A second pair of hands shoved frost into the trench, and for a moment 3 men worked as if nothing unusual were happening. Thomas's anger rose next. He stepped between the lever and the slab, breathing through pain in his side. He knew the lines of the fields by heart. He had walked them since boyhood. "Not that one," he said, pointing. "That stone marks our plot." You can't take it." His voice steadied into a calm that held danger. One of the men laughed. Another tightened his grip on the pry bar. A sharp, small sound cut through the field, Marta's foot on the lane, soft against packed earth. She did not call out, she did not run. She came up behind Thomas and touched his arm with 2 fingers. Thomas felt that touch like an anchor and turned so he could not see whether she trembled. Marta kept her gaze on the men. "Marta, Thomas," Davy put it deeper. He spat a word that was half curse, half plea. Marta folded her hands, pulled her shawl tighter, and walked a step forward. Suspicion gave way to doubt in her face. Thomas saw her weigh the faces, the badges, the lever. She kept the small iron key at her throat, the one she never showed anyone. The leader, a surveyor who wore a plain cap and a habit of measuring lines with a sharp, quick look, set his jaw. "This stone is being repositioned by order." He said, "We have papers. No violence will be needed." His voice tried for authority but lacked the roughness that makes threats believable in a cold field. "We don't accept orders nailed to doors." "Thomas, you know that." He had a memory of the mounted messenger, the courier who had hammered a letter to the chapel door, the paper's waxed seal catching early light. He remembered, too, how villagers had pushed close to read the new names and the new insignia. That notice had been a line on paper. Whoever moved the stone had turned paper into practice. "Then show us the paper, Marta." Her voice did not tremble now. She stepped a little closer and let the shawl part to reveal the rosary tucked in her apron, a small plain talisman, and the iron key that meant a household's right to a barn, larder, and a door. The men shifted. The surveyor lifted a folded packet from a pouch and tapped the wax seal. Thomas watched the motion and the fold. The seal bore a mark he had seen in town on the taxman's ledger, not the chapel's crest. The first emotion shift arrived for Thomas as a line of unease after anger, from anger to apprehension. He had expected a clean refusal and a fight that would end with blood or bravado. Instead, the paper and the seal introduced a bureaucratic gray that flattened the simple justice he wanted. He looked at Marta. She blinked slowly and then said, "Show the name." The surveyor read aloud a terse line that placed a strip of earth under a neighboring claim. Villagers had argued in the square with voice and pitched the day the courier nailed his decree. This readout made the same juridical sound, a second external event. A constable arrived from the lane, boots thudding, and bowed his shoulders against the cold. He carried a small ledger's book and a lantern that made a warm smear on his palm. Constable Halleck opened the book and said, "All present must sign a register when the line is fixed." That is procedure. His hand hovered by a pen. Argument spooled across the trench. Thomas moved to block the line of men who had started to tamp earth where the stone would sit. "You can't make us sign away our fields," he said. "You can't make us put our names on your paper and lose what our fathers worked for." His words were short. He spoke Thomas's name to himself. "You grew up here, you know this soil." Emil, the surveyor, answered with slow, clipped sentences. "Thomas, listen. Orders come down." "This is not my choice." He had a measured voice that tried to be technical. "Put the stone on that edge, sign here, and your crop rights will have a transition period." Emil's hands were steady. Thomas watched them. He watched how the surveyor avoided looking at the stone's carved crest that someone had tried to bury. The village's cracked rhythm fractured that morning. Villagers gathered at the lane, boots and shawls and thin breath clouding the air. Father Jovan came from the chapel, breathing against the cold and the ink, smell of officialdom. He took in the stone, the folded packet, the faces, and said, "We must avoid needless harm." His voice tried to mediate. He had read the decree, but not the hidden moves. Inside Marta's kitchen later that morning, the council collapsed into clashing lines. The room smelled of rye bread and oil. Marta set a loaf down, palms dusted with flour, as Thomas slammed his fist on the table to punctuate his words. "We can't sign," he said. "We give them a name, they write us off." "Emil, you know what the crests mean. That stone is ours by the cut and the carving." He jabbed a finger at the map Emil had brought. Emil folded his hands and spoke slowly. "Thomas, you will be safer if you sign the registry. The patrols will leave you alone for now. If you refuse, they can list you as refusing and claim punitive measures later." Thomas felt another emotion shift then, from apprehension to fear. Fear flickered in the base of his neck. He tightened his jaw and looked at the window where the lane ran out into fields he had plowed. Father Jovan stood between them. "We are a village." He said, "If some sign and some do not, what becomes of neighbors?" His tone made Marta's mouth thin. Marta spoke, voice low and sharp. "Father, do we barter lives for a ledger? My house is small. My son is away. If I refuse, I might lose the right to store seed. If I sign, I trade a boundary for paper, which keeps me fed." She Thomas's name once and looked at him. The argument ran through 3 short staccato rounds. "Thomas, we stand by the stone Emil." "You risk patrol reports, Father Jovan. Think of the old and the sick, Marta. Think of the child's cradle." The exchange had the required rapid back, and forth of neighbors arguing over a shared roofline. In the kitchen, the conflict tightened into choices that would reshape who harvested which strip of land. After midday, Thomas went to the field edge where churned earth pooled in a ditch and found a deeper surprise. He knelt and rasped away at damp loam with a finger. His hand closed on stone. He tugged. The slab came free in a stumble of black soil and a smell of old lime and moss. Excavated, the stone's carved crest revealed a symbol that matched the village records older than the courier's seal. It had been replaced, thrown into the ditch, and another had been set where it did not belong. This discovery produced the mid-chapter twist. Someone had not merely followed orders. Someone had moved the physical marker to match the paper. The revelation shifted Thomas's emotion again, from fear to clarity. He held the stone and felt an odd steadiness, a sense that the dispute now had a tangible proof that could be shown. "Look," he said loudly, standing with the crest held in both hands. They moved it. It was here, not there. Someone put that other stone in to match their paper. Villagers clustered. Emil's mouth tightened. Father Jovan stepped forward and inspected the carving closely. "This carving is old," he said. "It is our mark." Marta came up and touched the ridge of the crest with a thumb that left a wet smear. She looked at Thomas. Her hesitation gave way to a decision that was visible in the set of her shoulders. The emotion that had guided her, caution and careful preservation, moved into resolve. She turned toward the lane and began to walk. On the village green by late afternoon, people argued into dusk. Some neighbors spoke urgently about signing to secure immediate food deliveries and to keep patrols from seizing stored grain. Others, led by Thomas and now bolstered by Marta's evidence, urged refusal and the calling of witnesses from beyond the village to confirm the old crest. Neither side asked for wholesale violence, but both recognized a cost. Thomas and Marta stood at the heart of the crowd, and for the first time Marta spoke loudly enough for many to hear. "If we sign, they will list us and take rights in the records. If we refuse, they may list us as rebels and send men to inventory our barns." She inhaled and named a specific risk: losing the seed stored for spring. The crowd stiffened, people shuffled their feet. The external event every few paragraphs, arrivals, discoveries, confrontations, continued. Someone at the edge shouted that a patrol had been seen on the road. That night, lights moved along the hedgerow. A patrol arrived under orders to register names and seal fields. A lantern bobbed and boots tapped a measured tread. Thomas walked to meet them and stopped directly in the path where the new temporary post had been planted. He put his hands on his hips and refused to move. Marta went with him and held up the carved crest in her hand like a small, plain flag. Constable Halleck read the ledger aloud. "Names and signatures," he said, and his voice had an official flatness. He offered the pen. Thomas refused with a short, clear sentence. "I will not sign." Halleck's expression changed, and Thomas sensed in that shift a different kind of danger. The danger of paperwork used to justify loss. Halleck stepped forward and placed his hand on the register, as if to mark the point of refusal. Words became immediate action in the standoff. Thomas stood like a bar. Marta placed the iron key on the post where anyone could see it. "This is not a paper thing for us," she said. "It is a barn and a door. We keep this, we keep the key." Thomas felt a surge of fierce, contained emotion. Not bravado, but an urgency to protect a small household. He had moved from suspicion to anger to fear and now to a deliberate resolve that steered his limbs. Then Surveyor Emil stepped forward with a different proposal. "Sign a temporary register," he said. "We will note the claim, and you will have a transitional period. No patrols will take goods for now." His voice tried to splice safety into a ledger. A few villagers, tired and hungry, moved toward the pen. "Thomas, who guarantees they honor the mark?" Emil's mouth closed for a second. His hands brushed a pocket where the packet had been. Another external event arrived. The patrol's sergeant called for order and lifted his lantern higher. A third constable moved in to shadow Thomas. A short confrontation of words followed. Thomas. Emil, you put a new stone in the ditch, Emil. I followed orders from above. Thomas. Whose orders, Emil? I cannot say without breaking the chain. Thomas repeated the question louder and then quieter, and the quick dialogue exchange had 3 to 5 sharp turns. Father Jovan tried to intercede, asking for calm and witnesses. The mini cliffhanger arrived when the patrol's lantern light caught a figure on the road. A courier with mud on his boots, coming breathless, holding a folded sheet of paper. He ran into the square and shouted that an additional order had been sent down that morning, a register to be taken and kept for record. Marta grabbed the courier's arm and demanded to see the text. The courier fumbled and then handed the folded paper with a hand that shook. Thomas saw another face on the paper, an official signature that matched the ledger seal, but below it the courier had scrawled a note. Thomas read the note. Someone higher up had authorized a temporary hold pending further adjudication. That hand-scrawled line changed how people saw the scene. It meant delay and the possibility of negotiation. It also meant someone had been uncertain enough to leave a mark that looked like doubt. Thomas let his own resolve hesitate for a breath and then sharpen. He realized the fight was not simply between village and state, but between documentation and physical proof. When night thickened, the patrol made a set of pragmatic choices. Constable Halleck people to sign a ledger that recorded names and what they would keep for now. Some signed to protect seed and bread, others refused. Thomas stood with Marta and refused. Emil watched the signatures and did not intervene. The patrol left at the small hour after midnight with a terse note that the new stone would be fixed and a register left at the chapel, but not yet enforced with seizures. At the square, a small scene of enforced mercy played out. Halleck allowed a widow to note a list of essentials that would be spared that season. Marta wrote the items down in a trembling script, and Thomas held the paper while she signed. That night, there were small mercies amid the practical rearrangements. People traded food, moved livestock, and marked hedgerows with rope where the new line might be. Dawn came with Thomas walking the new visible line and counting narrow strips of land that remained theirs. He walked methodically, boots sinking into dew, and touched stakes and furrows with the same attention he had once given to planting depth. Marta watched from the porch, keeping the iron key in the palm of her hand and counting pulses in her throat. Her choices had shifted from fear to a quiet, stubborn care. She organized storage, labeled what she could, and set aside seed. In the end, the village rearranged itself along practical terms. Some neighbors had signed to keep grain safe under the new registry. Others had refused and kept certain fields unregistered. The physical proof Thomas had unearthed, the old crest carved on the cast, a side stone, became a petition's heart. They took that stone to the chapel and showed Father Jovan and a visiting scribe. The scribe wrote the observation into a witness statement, and the statement joined the small stack of papers that would be argued over in town. Thomas's arc closed that morning in a concrete decision. He would not sign the register yet, but he would not fight at the level of arms. Instead, he would gather witnesses from neighboring hamlets and present the carved crest as evidence. He took Marta's hand briefly and said, "Walk with me to the chapel. We'll have more people." She nodded and tucked the iron key into his palm, a transfer of trust and responsibility. It was not a heroic speech. It was a plan. The final moments focused on a single, decisive action. Emil packed his surveying tools and left with a curt nod. Constable Halleck closed his ledger and walked toward the lane, making note to report who refused or signed. Father Jovan kept the cast, a side stone in his arms like a weight that could be set down on the parish table. Marta put a loaf and a measure of seed into Thomas's satchel for the day he would walk to neighboring farms. The chapter concludes not with a grand proclamation, but with an exact, ordinary beat. Marta locked her kitchen door, fit the little iron key into the bolt, turned it with a practiced hand, and left the key on the table beside the rosary where it would be seen. Thomas bowed his head once, then walked toward the chapel with the cast, a side crest wrapped in cloth, followed by 3 neighbors who had chosen to stand with him. The register remained unsigned on Marta's gate, and the new stone sat partly set in the hedge, its placement contested, its shape a small stubborn fact that would be argued over paper and witness in the days to come.